The town of Bold Nob, located in the state of Arkansas, was a typical small American community where everyone knew each other. With a population of just over 3,000, it was known for its peaceful atmosphere, friendly neighbors, and leisurely pace of life. Serious crime rarely occurred here, and residents prided themselves on their safe and close-knit community. It was in such a town that Janie Lee Connor Ballard was born on the 11th of September 1945, a woman whose life and tragic death shook this peaceful place to its core. Janie's parents, Renard and Barbara Connor, were respected people in town. They raised their daughter to be loving, caring, and respectful of others, which was reflected in her character. Janie had two brothers, Neil and Danny, with whom she always maintained a warm relationship. Her childhood was spent in an atmosphere of home comfort and stability, which helped her to grow up a kind-hearted, open, and independent woman. Being energetic and free-spirited, Janie made many friends from an early age. She was always the soul of the company. She was adored for her sense of humor, kindness, and sincerity. She didn't just value friendship, she shared care and respect with those she called friends. One of her most loyal companions in life was her English bulldog Gracie May, whom she loved immensely and considered part of the family. Janie never aspired to luxury and ostentatious success. More important to her were sincerity, hard work, and family values. These same qualities attracted her future husband, Lester Ballard, a man who shared her views and aspirations. They met in Little Rock, worked in printing and engineering technology. Lester was a reliable, intelligent, and hardworking man, and their romance developed quickly. He knew Janie was exactly the woman he wanted to build a life with. When they married, their union seemed like the perfect example of a strong marriage based on trust, partnership, and shared goals. Together, they started a successful business, Shepherd's Printing, Inca Printing Services, and engineering supply company. Their company quickly gained a reputation as a reliable supplier, and because of their hard work ethic, the business prospered. Shepherd's Printing's office was located in Little Rock, and the couple often worked together to discuss growth strategies and manage the business. A few years after their marriage, Janie and Lester had their only daughter, Leslie Jane. This event was a pivotal moment in the Ballard family's life. As their business prospered, Janie and Lester could afford a luxurious life. However, despite their financial prosperity, they did not pursue wealth for the sake of wealth itself. They lived in a modest brick house on Cedar Hill Road, which became a true family nest. Leslie grew up in an atmosphere of love and care, and her parents did everything they could to make sure she never needed anything. Janie adored her daughter and wanted the best future for her. She paid much attention to her, raising her to be kind, well-mannered, and educated. The Ballard family was known for their hospitality, and their home was always full of friends and relatives. Janie enjoyed the comforts of home, tending to her garden, caring for her flowers, and loved long walks with her bulldog. But Janie was not only a good wife and mother, she was also active in the community. She played a key role in the formation of the Cedar Hill Terrace Property Owners Association, which helped improve housing conditions in the neighborhood. In addition, Janie was one of the organizers of Neighborhood Crime Watch, a program to improve safety in Pulaski County. She wasn't afraid to take charge, working with local authorities and police to ensure her neighborhood remained calm. Her enthusiasm and dedication made her known and respected among her neighbors. She was loved for her kindness, activism, and desire to make the world a better place. In addition to her work and community activities, Janie was a passionate gardener. She became a member of the Master Gardeners program, studying botany and landscape design. Her garden at her home on Cedar Hill Road was a model of beauty and order. Leslie did take an interest in the family business and helped her parents with management. She worked at Shepherd's Printing and seemed involved and interested in the business her parents had been building for decades. But that all changed when Mike McCool came into her life. Mike McCool was not the kind of man Janie and Lester wanted to have by their daughter's side. He was a man who never had a steady income and was rumored to be involved in petty crime. However, Leslie did not seem to notice or want to notice these flaws. When Leslie brought Mike home and introduced him to her parents, Janie and Lester immediately felt uneasy. He seemed insincere, his manners were rude, and his outlook on life too self-serving. Lester was particularly opposed to the relationship. He saw Mike as a man who was using Leslie for money. Janie was concerned too, but hoped her daughter would figure out the situation on her own and realize that this man would not bring her happiness. But the more the parents tried to talk to Leslie, the more she became distant. She stopped taking part in the family business, began to communicate less and less with her parents, and spent all her time with Mike. Over time, their relationship with Leslie soured completely. She came out against her parents, announcing that she loved Mike and that it was her choice. Despite Janie's tears and Lester's warnings, Leslie married him. This marriage was the beginning of the destruction of the Ballard family. After the wedding, Mike took control of Leslie's life. He talked her into quitting her job at Shepherd's Printing Inc., even though she loved the business herself. He then began spending the family money on entertainment and expensive trips. He arranged ski resorts, vacations at expensive hotels, all the while not working anywhere. Janie and Lester watched in horror as their daughter became dependent on her husband. They still tried to talk to her, but Leslie wouldn't listen. She finally detached herself from her parents and stopped being interested in their lives. On the 19th of August, 2003, Lester Ballard died. He was 69 years old, and his death was a huge blow to Janie. She lost the man she loved, with whom she had lived all her life, with whom she had built a business, raised her daughter, and dreamed of the future. She didn't quit the business. She continued to run Shepherd's Printing Inc., trying to hang on for the sake of her husband's memory. But her life was never the same again. Since her husband's death, Janie had lived alone. She tried to run the business as she had before, but the grief of loss and the strained relationship with her daughter weighed on her soul. In recent weeks, she had felt anxious and told friends she feared for her safety. She was last seen on the evening of the 12th of September talking to neighbors. She showed no excitement, but what went on behind the closed doors of her home that night will remain a mystery. In the morning hours of the 13th of September, her close friend Holloway arrived to visit Janie. She had visited her often since Lester's death, knowing her friend was taking the loss hard. As Holloway pulled up to the house, something seemed odd to her. The door was ajar, and Gracie May was nowhere to be seen. Usually the dog greeted guests at the gate, but today, silence. She called to Janie, but there was dead silence in reply. The uneasy foreboding grew stronger. Climbing onto the porch, she looked inside the house and froze with horror. On the floor, in a pool of blood, lay the mutilated body of Janie Ballard. She had been murdered with horrific brutality. But even without a medical report, Holloway knew at once that it was cold-blooded murder. Shock turned to panic. With trembling hands, she pulled out her cell phone and called the police. A few minutes after Holloway's alarm call, the sirens of police cars sounded on Cedar Hill Road. Bold Nob was a small and quiet town where crimes of this nature were rare, much less such brutal murders. Pulaski County police officers quickly arrived on the scene, realizing that what they were facing was not just a simple theft or domestic dispute, but something truly terrifying. The first thing detectives saw when they entered the house was blood. A puddle of scarlet liquid spread across the living room floor, and in its very center lay the body of 58-year-old Janie Ballard. The woman had been murdered with horrific brutality. Everything around her indicated that her last moments had been filled with unspeakable pain and horror. Inspecting the crime scene, police quickly noticed a number of details. Valuable items were missing from the house, including her late husband's coin collection, expensive jewelry that Janie only wore on special occasions, and one of her cars. These facts led investigators to assume that this was a typical robbery that turned into a murder. Perhaps the perpetrator did not expect to encounter the homeowner and in a panic committed a brutal crime. However, the longer the detectives studied the picture of what had happened, the more they became alarmed by the excessive brutality of the attack. Usually, burglars caught off guard try to act quickly, but here, on the contrary, there was a tremendous fury. 70 stab wounds indicated not just a desire to get rid of a witness, but something much more personal. The question arose, was this really a simple robbery, or did the motive lie much deeper? Soon the police began to receive information from Janie's friends and acquaintances. Especially important was the statement of her friend Holloway, who had first discovered the body. She immediately made it clear that she doubted the robbery version. A few days before the tragedy, Janie had shared her fears with her, saying that she felt threatened and feared for her life. There was anxiety in her voice, and now those words took on a new, ominous meaning. Holloway revealed that Janie had spoken repeatedly in recent weeks about the strained relationship with her daughter Leslie and her husband Mike McCool. Since Lester Ballard's death less than a month ago, Leslie had become virtually estranged from her mother, and their contact had been minimal. Janie sensed something was wrong, but couldn't explain why she was haunted by the feeling. Most importantly, in the days before the murder, she had spoken openly about her fear of her own daughter. Now investigators were not just looking at a robbery, but were beginning to think about a premeditated murder, carefully planned for the sake of a large inheritance. Examining the house, forensic investigators tried to reconstruct the crime scene. The assailant clearly knew where the valuables were, acted quickly and confidently. It seemed that the killer was either well-oriented in the house or had an idea of Janie's daily routine. And given that the attack had taken place at night or early morning, it seemed as if the perpetrator knew when Janie would be alone. In addition, the fact that the killer did not try to hide the traces of the crime attracted special attention. On the contrary, the number of stab wounds, their chaotic arrangement, and extreme brutality spoke of the fact that the crime was committed against an emotional background. Such murders are rarely random. They are committed with a clear motive, when the victim is either hated or wants to destroy as an obstacle on the way to a certain goal. The investigators now realized that the case was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. The murder of Janie Ballard could be not just a random act of violence, but an elaborate crime, the purpose of which was to eliminate a woman of considerable wealth. The police began looking for suspects, and the main figures were people who had good reason to want Janie dead. One of the first steps of the investigation was to establish the whereabouts of Leslie and Mike on the day of the murder. If they could confirm their alibis, the family conspiracy theory could collapse. However, if the evidence begins to form a coherent picture, it will become obvious. Someone close to Janie crossed the line, destroying not only her life, but also his own destiny. After the investigation finally rejected the version of accidental robbery, Leslie Ballard and her husband, Mike McCool, turned out to be the main suspects. Their motive was obvious. Lester Ballard's will stipulated that his fortune would pass to his daughter only if her mother died within a month of him. Janie was murdered less than a month after her husband's death, and her death looked like someone wanted to disguise it as a brutal attack by an unknown perpetrator. This fact left investigators in no doubt the crime had been carefully planned. During the investigation, the police began to find out Leslie and Mike's movements on the night of the murder. It turned out that during the critical hours they were outside the city, and then, as if nothing had happened, returned to Bold Nob after the discovery of Janie's body. It looked like an attempt to create an alibi for themselves. Moreover, phone records showed that Leslie's cell phone was registered in the Cedar Hill Road area on the night of the murder, despite her claims that she was elsewhere. Investigators also began analyzing evidence found in the couple's home and discovered black paint that Leslie would later learn she had used to disguise her face during the attack. When Leslie and Mike were called in for questioning, they tried to act confident and calm. Leslie claimed that she knew nothing about the attack and allegedly learned of her mother's death only after a call from friends. Mike confirmed her words, assuring her that they were vacationing in Hot Springs that day and could not have been involved in the crime. However, the more the detectives questioned the couple, the more inconsistencies appeared in their stories. What was important was that no one had seen Janie with strangers before the murder, which meant that she could only have opened the door to someone she knew and trusted. The evidence gathered was becoming more and more obvious. The missing jewelry and coin collection suggested that the killer knew exactly what to look for. A random burglar would be unlikely to take items whose value was known only to the family. In addition, the police found traces of black paint in Leslie and Mike's house, which seemed particularly odd. As the investigators ramped up the pressure and provided her with the results of the phone records, Leslie began to get nervous. While at the beginning of the interrogation, she tried to portray confidence, by the middle her voice had become quieter and her movements more nervous. Her behavior was in stark contrast to Mike's, who kept a cold expression on his face, as if nothing was happening. Under the pressure of incontrovertible evidence, Leslie finally broke down and confessed to killing her mother. She revealed that the idea of getting rid of Janie had been born in Mike's mind when he learned of Lester's will. It was an incredible opportunity for him to get a lot of money, but the only obstacle to the inheritance, Janie herself. Mike began to convince his wife that killing her mother was the only way to get rich quick, and that if they didn't do it in the next few weeks, the inheritance would be out of their hands forever. The plan was simple: stage an attack and robbery to distract the police from the family's version of the conflict. On the fateful day, Leslie put on dark clothes, concealed her face with a wig and black paint, and hid in the bushes near the house. She waited for her mother to come outside, or at least be in a vulnerable position. When Janie came out into the yard, Leslie attacked her, knocked her down, and began stabbing her with a furious fury. In all, more than 70 blows were inflicted, and Janie had no chance of survival. After the murder, Leslie stole jewelry from the house as well as a priceless set of coins that belonged to her late father. All of this was done to make the crime look like a simple robbery. When it was over, Leslie changed into clean clothes, and together with Mike, they immediately left for Hot Springs, hoping it would give them a solid alibi. After the investigation began, they returned to Bold Nob to make sure the police would not suspect them. However, it was this return that looked suspicious, because it would have been more logical to stay in Hot Springs and not show up in town immediately after the murder. After Leslie confessed to the crime, investigators immediately charged her and Mike McCool. For the police, there was no longer any doubt. The murder was an elaborate conspiracy to obtain Lester Ballard's inheritance. Leslie was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, as well as the theft of her deceased mother's property. Mike, as co-defendant, was charged with organizing the murder and assisting in the concealment of evidence. They now faced a trial that would set the record straight. After the investigation was completed, the case of Leslie Ballard and Mike McCool moved to trial. The Pulaski County Prosecutor's Office presented an impressive body of evidence that included not only Leslie's own confession, but also evidence that supported her guilt. Telephone connections indicating her presence in the area of the murder, traces of black paint on her belongings, and stolen items from her mother's home. Particular attention was paid to her attempt to create an alibi by traveling to Hot Springs immediately after the crime. All of this suggested that the murder was carefully planned and motivated solely by greed. The trial caused widespread public outcry. The case, dubbed in the press as "the daughter who killed her mother for money," became one of the most talked about crime stories in Arkansas. Not only local, but also national media followed the story, reporting from the courtroom. For the residents of Bold Nob, a small town where everyone knew each other, the tragedy of the Ballard family came as a real shock. Many could not believe that Leslie, a girl who grew up in love and prosperity, could kill her own mother in cold blood for the sake of inheritance. The hearings began in 2004. In the dock were Leslie Ballard and her accomplice Mike McCool. They were charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and theft of property of the late Janie Ballard. During the trial, prosecutors detailed the circumstances of the crime based on the evidence and witness testimony collected. The defense side tried to mitigate Leslie's guilt by portraying her as a victim of Mike McCool's manipulation. The defense attorneys argued that he was the one who devised the murder plan and convinced Leslie of its necessity. They also insisted that Mike had been controlling Leslie for a long time, exerting psychological pressure on her, suppressing her will and forcing her to make decisions contrary to her character. In support of this defense case, the defense attorneys presented several testimonies confirming that Mike could have been an abuser. However, the prosecution did not let these arguments go unanswered. Prosecutors presented the court with testimony from Leslie's friends and acquaintances who claimed that she had consciously turned her back on her parents long before the crime and not only voluntarily entered into financial fraud with Mike, but also actively participated in its planning. The main evidence of her guilt was that it was Leslie who stabbed her mother to death. Forensic experts found that the blows were inflicted with particular cruelty, which, according to the prosecution, proved her conscious intention to bring the crime to an end. After weeks of hearings, the judge put the case in the hands of the jury. Their deliberations lasted less than 24 hours, indicating a firm confidence in the verdict. The verdict was unanimous. Leslie Ballard was found guilty of first-degree murder. In May 2004, the court handed down the final verdict. Leslie Ballard was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In addition, she was added 60 months for stealing her mother's property. Thus, she was to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Mike McCool, found guilty of being an accessory to premeditated murder and theft, received a lighter sentence: 40 years in prison for murder and 20 years for theft. However, the sentences were ordered to be served consecutively, significantly increasing his time behind bars. When the judge announced the verdict, Leslie and Mike showed little emotion. They listened silently to the verdict, maintaining an outwardly calm demeanor. However, when the bailiffs began to take them out of the hall, Leslie suddenly burst into tears. After the harsh verdict, Leslie Ballard and Mike McCool were sent to prison to serve their sentences. However, the trial did not end there. In March 2006, Mike McCool attempted to appeal the verdict, hoping to reduce his sentence or, at best, to get a retrial. The main defense argument in the appeal was the claim that Mike McCool was not the direct perpetrator of the murder, and that his role in the crime was exaggerated by the prosecution. The defense attorneys tried to argue that while he was indeed involved in the planning, he did not inflict the fatal blows, but only influenced Leslie to push her toward the murder. They argued that the prosecution improperly merged his case with Leslie's and presented him as an equal co-conspirator, even though, they said, he was not directly present at the scene of the murder. In addition, the defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's evidence, arguing that Leslie Ballard's testimony was given under duress and her confession could have been used against Mike without proper fact-checking. They argued that Leslie, being emotionally unstable, may have stonewalled her husband to reduce her responsibility for the crime. However, the Pulaski County Prosecutor's Office stood firm. They stated that Mike was the mastermind behind the murder, and that without his manipulation, Leslie would never have taken such a step. Moreover, the evidence spoke for itself. He helped her with preparations, provided her with an alibi, helped hide evidence, and tried to confuse the investigation. The appellate court scrutinized the case file and also reviewed the evidence presented during the main trial. They concluded that all the evidence was lawfully collected, and that Leslie's testimony, even if obtained under duress, was corroborated by other physical evidence. As a result, the court upheld the verdict, and the appeal was dismissed. The story of Janie Ballard's murder became one of the most brutal and inhumane tragedies that occurred in the small town of Bold Nob. It would seem that Leslie Ballard grew up in love and prosperity, had everything for a happy life, caring parents, a successful family business, and a comfortable future. However, greed, the influence of a manipulative husband, and the desire for easy money led her down a dark path that destroyed not only her life, but also the very essence of family values on which she was raised. Today, Leslie Ballard spends her days in a jail cell, with no chance of ever being released. Mike McCool is also serving his time, with no hope of being released anytime soon. Their lives ended the moment they decided to go against their family, breaking the sacred bonds between mother and daughter. Janie Ballard's murder has come to symbolize a tragic injustice, a woman who gave everything to her daughter but ended up victimizing her. Perhaps if Leslie had made a different choice, things might have turned out differently. But history has no subjunctive mood. Now her name will forever remain in the chronicles of crime as a reminder that betrayal for money does not go unpunished.